Many believe they know the God of the Bible, a loving, forgiving creator, full of mercy and grace. But what if I told you that the Bible offers two starkly different portrayals of God? In the Old Testament, we meet Yahweh, a fearsome, commanding deity who often demands obedience with fire and blood. He orders massacres, punishes entire nations, and demands absolute loyalty from his chosen people. In the New Testament, however, we encounter Jesus, who speaks of love, forgiveness, and peace. Is this the same God? Or are we seeing two fundamentally different beings? Let's journey back to the Old Testament, where the portrayal of Yahweh's actions raises questions not only about divine justice, but also about the nature of divinity itself. Genesis begins with a world shrouded in chaos. The earth was formless and void, and darkness covered the surface of the deep. Genesis 1:2. Yahweh, the Old Testament God, imposes order on this chaos. He separates light from darkness, waters from dry land, and fills the void with life. Yet, his creative acts feel less like harmonious artistry and more like a battle, a forceful taming of a wild, untamed world. Every act of creation is an assertion of dominance, a demonstration of Yahweh's power. This sets the tone for his relationship with humanity, one of control, judgment, and unwavering authority. Enjoying the story? Like, subscribe, and share to support us. Let's continue. As the Israelites march toward the Promised Land, Yahweh's commands grow darker. In Joshua 6:21, the city of Jericho is captured, and his instructions are clear. Devote the city to the Lord and destroy every living thing in it, men, women, children, cattle, sheep, and donkeys. Imagine the chaos as soldiers storm through the city, swords drawn, leaving nothing alive. It's a chilling scene of divine-sanctioned slaughter, one that challenges our understanding of morality and justice. How could the God who created life command such destruction? For the Israelites, this was divine justice. For others, it was genocide. The Gnostics, an early Christian sect, had an unsettling explanation. They believed Yahweh was not the true God, but a demiurge, a flawed, tyrannical being obsessed with control and destruction. To the Gnostics, Yahweh was not the creator of the universe, but the architect of this broken, material world. They viewed him as a jealous ruler, whose violent tendencies were a reflection of his imperfection. By contrast, they saw Jesus as a messenger from a higher, true God, sent to liberate humanity from Yahweh's oppressive rule. This interpretation offers a stark contrast to mainstream Christianity and raises profound questions about the nature of divinity. The New Testament opens with a different tone. In John 1:1-3, Jesus is introduced as the Logos, the Word through whom all things were made. Here, creation is not a battle, but an act of harmony. Jesus doesn't subdue chaos. He brings order through divine wisdom and love. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. John 1:4. This portrayal stands in stark contrast to Yahweh's forceful acts in Genesis. Where Yahweh imposes his will, Jesus radiates calm authority, showing that true power comes not from domination, but from love. Jesus' teachings directly challenge Yahweh's harsh laws. In John 8, a woman caught in adultery is brought before Jesus. According to Yahweh's law, she should be stoned to death. The crowd awaits Jesus' verdict, stones in hand, but Jesus does the unthinkable. "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone," he declares. The crowd disperses, and Jesus tells the woman, "Go and sin no more." In this single act, Jesus defies Yahweh's rigid system of punishment and offers a path of grace. It's a moment that encapsulates the stark differences between the two portrayals of God. Yahweh's exclusivity is evident throughout the Old Testament. Deuteronomy 7:6 declares Israel to be a people holy to the Lord, chosen out of all nations. This divine favoritism leads to countless conflicts, as other nations, Canaanites, Amalekites, Philistines, become enemies to be conquered or destroyed. Yahweh's covenant is a private contract, a relationship reserved for one people alone. For those outside this circle, Yahweh offers no mercy. The New Testament, however, breaks down these walls. Jesus' message is universal. In Matthew 28:19, he commands his disciples to go and make disciples of all nations. The God of the New Testament is no longer exclusive. He welcomes everyone: Jews, Gentiles, sinners, and outcasts. This dramatic shift raises questions. Did Yahweh change his plan, or are we witnessing the actions of two entirely different gods? Yahweh's justice is built on blood. Sacrifices are central to his covenant with Israel. Bulls, goats, and lambs are slaughtered to atone for sin. The law demands these offerings, reinforcing a system where guilt is absolved through death. This cycle of bloodshed underscores the gravity of sin, but also the severity of Yahweh's judgment. Jesus ends this cycle with his own sacrifice. Unlike the Old Testament offerings, his death is not another transaction, but the ultimate redemption. Hebrews 9:12 explains, "He entered once for all into the holy places, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by his own blood, securing eternal redemption." Jesus transforms the concept of sacrifice from one of fear to one of love, offering liberation from sin and death. The Gnostics interpreted Jesus' sacrifice as a rebellion against Yahweh's flawed creation. To them, Jesus didn't die to satisfy Yahweh's wrath, but to free humanity from his oppressive system. The material world, with its suffering and chaos, was seen as a prison crafted by the demiurge Yahweh. Jesus' death and resurrection weren't just acts of redemption, but acts of cosmic liberation. His resurrection was a victory not just over death, but over the flawed creation itself, signaling that there was a greater truth beyond Yahweh's realm. Yahweh's punishments in the Old Testament are swift and brutal. When humanity strays too far, he unleashes catastrophic judgment. The flood in Genesis 6-9 is a prime example. Yahweh drowns the entire world, sparing only Noah, his family, and a small remnant of animals. This act of mass destruction wipes the slate clean, but raises a troubling question. Why would a God of love resort to such overwhelming violence? Was this a display of divine justice or a tyrant's rage? In the New Testament, judgment shifts from immediate physical destruction to eternal consequences. Jesus warns of hell, a place of eternal separation from God. In Matthew 25:41, he speaks of eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. Unlike Yahweh's instant wrath, the punishment Jesus describes focuses on the soul and the afterlife. This transition from physical to spiritual judgment reflects a profound shift in focus from the material to the eternal. Yahweh's laws in the Old Testament are rigid and unforgiving. Numbers 15:32-36 recounts a man who was stoned to death for gathering wood on the Sabbath. The law permits no nuance or leniency. Obedience is demanded, and punishment is swift for those who falter. This rigidity creates a system of fear, where stepping out of line results in death or exile. Jesus directly challenges this rigidity. In Mark 2:27, he declares, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath," overturning Yahweh's strict interpretation of the law. Jesus heals on the Sabbath, prioritizing human need over legalistic obedience. His actions reveal a God of compassion who values mercy over ritual. This stark contrast to Yahweh's demands underscores the tension between Old and New Testament portrayals of divine will. Yahweh's portrayal in the Old Testament is often that of a tribal warlord, a protector of Israel who wages war against surrounding nations. In 1 Samuel 15:3, Yahweh commands Saul to annihilate the Amalekites. "Do not spare them, but put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys." This is a God whose justice is delivered through total destruction, erasing entire populations to secure the future of his chosen people. These stories present a deity deeply invested in control through fear and force. While the Israelites may have seen this as divine protection, others would see it as merciless genocide. Jesus offers a drastically different vision of power. In Matthew 5:44, He teaches, "Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." Far from commanding armies, Jesus shows power through humility. In John 13, he kneels to wash the feet of his disciples, modeling servitude instead of dominance. His triumphs are not achieved through violence, but through compassion and sacrifice. This stark contrast to Yahweh's warlike actions challenges traditional notions of divine justice, inviting us to see power as rooted in love and service. The Old Testament places great emphasis on sacrifices as a means of justice and reconciliation. The temple in Jerusalem becomes a hub of atonement rituals. Bulls, goats, and lambs are slaughtered daily to cleanse the people of sin. Leviticus outlines strict laws for these offerings, reinforcing the idea that sin demands blood. The endless cycle of sacrifice underscores Yahweh's strict standards for justice and the severe consequences of disobedience. Jesus redefines sacrifice with his crucifixion. Unlike the animal offerings of the Old Testament, his death is a once-and-for-all act of atonement. In Hebrews 9:12, we read, "He entered once for all into the holy places, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by means of his own blood." This ultimate sacrifice abolishes the old system, replacing it with grace and forgiveness. His death is not about appeasing Yahweh's wrath, but about liberating humanity from sin and restoring the relationship between God and people. Yahweh's presence in the Old Testament is tangible yet restrictive. The Ark of the Covenant, carried by the Israelites, symbolizes his power, but also his danger. In 2 Samuel 6:6-7, Uzzah touches the ark to steady it and is struck dead instantly. This episode underscores Yahweh's holiness and the strict boundaries he places between himself and humanity. Access to Yahweh requires layers of intermediaries, priests, rituals, and physical symbols. His presence is awe-inspiring but distant and fraught with peril. Jesus shatters these barriers, opening direct access to God. At the moment of his death, Matthew 27:51 records, "The curtain of the temple was torn in two, from top to bottom." This dramatic event symbolizes the removal of all separation between God and humanity. No longer confined to sacred spaces or mediated by priests, God's presence is available to everyone. Jesus' teachings invite personal connection with the divine, making rituals and intermediaries unnecessary. Yahweh's punishments often targeted entire communities or nations. In Genesis 19, the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah are obliterated by fire and brimstone due to their wickedness. This isn't a surgical act of justice, it's a cataclysm. Innocent lives are lost alongside the guilty, emphasizing the indiscriminate nature of Yahweh's wrath. To ancient readers, this might have signified the severity of sin, but to modern eyes, it raises troubling questions about morality and divine proportionality. Jesus offers a new understanding of judgment. Instead of swift, indiscriminate punishment, he speaks of individual accountability. In John 8:11, he tells the adulterous woman, "Neither do I condemn you, go and sin no more." Jesus emphasizes personal transformation over collective destruction, encouraging repentance as a path to redemption. This approach reframes the idea of justice from retribution to restoration, marking a profound shift from Yahweh's methods. The Gnostics viewed Yahweh's Old Testament laws as a system of oppression. To them, the strict rules and harsh penalties were designed to enslave humanity under fear and control. From dietary restrictions to ritual sacrifices, every aspect of life was governed by Yahweh's commands. The Gnostics believed these laws served the demiurge's purpose, keeping people tethered to the flawed material world rather than seeking higher spiritual truths. Jesus represents the antithesis of this system. His teachings focus on inner freedom, love, and grace. "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest," he says in Matthew 11:28. By rejecting rigid legalism, Jesus liberates his followers from the burdens of Yahweh's law, offering a direct connection to a higher, compassionate God. For the Gnostics, this wasn't just a message of redemption, it was a declaration of independence from Yahweh's tyranny. Yahweh's obsession with exclusivity is evident in his repeated emphasis on Israel as his chosen people. The covenant with Abraham in Genesis 17 establishes a special relationship between Yahweh and his descendants, marked by the sign of circumcision. This exclusivity reinforces a clear divide: those who belong to Yahweh's covenant and those who do not. The rest of humanity is often portrayed as adversaries or tools to further Israel's destiny. Jesus dismantles this exclusivity with a message of universal salvation. In Luke 10:33, he tells the parable of the Good Samaritan, portraying a despised outsider as the embodiment of love and righteousness. Jesus' ministry reaches out to tax collectors, sinners, and Gentiles, signaling that God's grace is not confined to any single group. This universality challenges the Old Testament's narrow focus, offering a vision of inclusivity that defies Yahweh's earlier commands. Sacrifices in the Old Testament are transactional. Blood is spilled to appease Yahweh's anger or atone for sin. Leviticus 17:11 declares, "It is the blood that makes atonement for one's life." This system underscores Yahweh's demand for justice through death, a stark reminder of the high cost of sin under his rule. Jesus replaces this system with a singular, ultimate sacrifice. His crucifixion is not just another ritual, it's the end of rituals. "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." Matthew 26:28. Jesus' death fulfills the need for atonement, but it also transcends it, offering forgiveness as a gift rather than a transaction. For the Gnostics, this act wasn't about satisfying Yahweh, but about liberating humanity from his flawed system entirely. The resurrection of Jesus is a profound rejection of Yahweh's dominion over life and death. To the Gnostics, it wasn't just a miracle, but a cosmic rebellion. By rising from the dead, Jesus demonstrated that Yahweh's material creation, bound by suffering and mortality, was not the ultimate reality. His resurrection opened the door to a higher truth, offering humanity a way out of the flawed, broken world created by Yahweh.